of types, including macro, landscape, and nature photography. In addition to being honored as Photographer of the Year award at the Chester County Camera Club in Pennsylvania, Betsy has received numerous recognitions for her artistic photography, including a Silver Medal Award at the Wilmington International Exhibition of Photography and a First Place Award in Photography at the Philadelphia Flower Show. Betsy is an active member of the Chester County Camera Club and has given numerous presentations and led workshops for area camera clubs, including ours. I just want to thank Betsy for presenting tonight. She's a fantastic presenter. I always love listening to Betsy and hearing what she has to share with us. So Betsy, go ahead and take over.
Thank you, Jay. Okay. How's that look? Okay.
It's awesome.
Okay, great. Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me back again. I've already presented to this club twice. I did still lifes 2 years ago, and last year I think I did one called "How Did You Get That Shot?" There is some overlap in this one with the one I did last year. So if any of you on this saw that one last year, you will see a few of the same images, but there is a lot of new stuff that you haven't seen. So with that, put yourself on mute. I will take a pause a little bit past the halfway point for questions. So in the meantime, hold your questions or put them in the chat, and I'll answer some questions at the break. And again, of course, open it up at the end. So motion, I mean, there are just so many different interpretations. We can freeze a moment in time or capture a special moment, use techniques to manipulate motion or stretch it out, or maybe to see things in a different way. Or we can use motion to create a mood or a feeling. So here are some of the motion techniques that I will cover. I'm going to talk about freezing action and also long exposure, panning and zooming, rear curtain sync. If you're talking about motion, you have to talk about photographing water. I'm going to touch on some neutral density filters and some fun things like light painting motion, a fun toy called a pixel stick. And I will wrap up with some fun tricks and Photoshop ideas to simulate motion. And most of the images that I'll show are mine, but I have included some by my husband, Jim. Some of you know him. He is the guilty party who got me into photography a little more than 10 years ago. He's very talented. He's also my technical support. I tend to focus a little bit more on the artistic side of things. I can sometimes be a little bit technically challenged. And I find it's always a challenge creating a presentation for a diverse audience with all different levels of experience. I know the members in this club, some perhaps are just starting out, but I know that many are very experienced and talented photographers. So I'm going to start out with some basic motion techniques and gradually add some more and more advanced techniques. And no matter how much we know, one of the things I love about photography is that there is always something new to learn and some new technique to try out. Most of this presentation involves in-camera techniques, but I will finish up with some post-processing ideas. And I always like to start with a little bit of history. You may be familiar with this very famous photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson, often used to illustrate what is known as the decisive moment, when the visual and the psychological elements in a scene briefly come together. I mean, not only did he capture the motion with the man's feet suspended above the water, but look how the reflection on the water mirrors the image in the circus poster behind him. And I love this image of his of a cyclist. So it's believed that he found his composition and waited for the cyclist to move into that exact desired position, another decisive moment. So these are both examples of freezing a moment in time. So let's move on to an image that shows motion, and we're going to settle a little bit. So a long time ago, there was this businessman who he owned racehorses, and he needed to settle a little bet among his buddies because he said that when his horses raced, all four legs came off the ground at the same time. But no one had ever actually seen that, so no one believed it. So he paid photographer Edward Muybridge to help him prove his point. And Muybridge set up this series of 12 cameras along a track. There were wires strung along. So when the horse raced through, he would trip the wires and set off a camera, 12 different cameras. So here you can see he won his bet. In the third image on the top, all four legs are indeed off the ground. So let's move to a single image that shows motion. Philadelphia artist Thomas Eakins was also a photographer. He developed his own method with the goal of studying anatomy, which he did to further his paintings. So whereas Muybridge, he relied on a series of cameras to create multiple photos, Eakins used a single camera to produce a series of exposures superimposed on one negative. And I want to mention one more. It was a 25-year-old Ansel Adams who created this image of the monolith of Half Dome. And he first used a yellow filter to darken the sky a bit. But his experience of what he saw was more dramatic than he knew he would get from that yellow filter. And so he hiked up this mountain with all this heavy gear. He only had one glass plate left. And he tried a red filter, hoping that it would darken the sky to create the image that he imagined or visualized. And this experiment actually proved to be a turning point for Ansel Adams because for the first time, he was conscious of the difference between what his camera lens saw and what he saw in his eye as the final print. He discovered photographic visualization, a concept I'll bring up again later. So we'll be talking a lot about either freezing time or capturing a period of time, either using a very fast shutter speed or a slow shutter speed. So most cameras have a mode called shutter priority. Some cameras, it may be called TV for time value. And so set your camera to shutter priority mode. And this means you tell your camera how long you want the exposure to be. And in most cases, you can let the camera decide the rest. So let's start with the most basic techniques of motion photography. Fast exposures can freeze actions that happen faster than the blink of an eye. So this was shot at 1/2000th of a second. And again, people tend to ask about settings. So I will include the aperture and ISO on most images, but the most important factor here is shutter speed. A skateboarder in Central Park, frozen in midair at 1/500th of a second. Here's my husband, Jim. He's just tossing cherry blossoms in the air. More skateboard antics. This one was taken by Jim. And here I like to imagine what thoughts must be going through the minds of the couple with their feet in the air. Fast shutter speeds are almost always used to capture sports events, to freeze the action. And in addition to sports, there are many other fleeting moments that the only way to capture is with a fast shutter speed. And I had experimented with this quite a few years ago, but I really had a jump start a couple years ago when I got advice from Ginny Lodge. And I know Ginny told me she couldn't be on the call tonight, but she'll watch the replay. So a shout out to Ginny because she creates the best frozen soap bubbles ever. So I thank Ginny for her helpful tips and her inspiration. That's how we learn from one another. And if you've tried this, you know how hard it is because if it isn't cold enough or if there's any wind at all, your bubbles will pop before you have a chance to push the shutter. And and by the way, be prepared to freeze your fingers off. And you have to be fast because they don't usually last that long. I was just happy to get this one right at the moment of exploding. But if you can capture these elusive bubbles, you may get some beautiful crystal formations like these. When photographing wildlife, like this grizzly bear in British Columbia, I wanted to be sure to freeze any movement to get a sharp image. So at 1/500th of a second, it can freeze action. But for faster action, like birds in flight, you probably want to go with 1/1000th, 1/2000th of a second. Again, these images are all taken with the camera set to shutter priority. And I want to point out the magic of a fast shutter speed. I'm not a bird photographer, but I did have a goal of capturing a hummingbird, so at least I got these shots. I included this to make a point about motion. Think about the speed of a hummingbird's wings. They flap or actually make a figure eight movement 50 times a second, much faster than you can see with your eyes. So, think about the feet of that racehorse. No one had ever actually seen all 4 feet in the air. Well, without high speed photography, we would never see the wing of a hummingbird in flight. And a great place to capture motion is Middle Creek Wildlife Area. Jim and I didn't get there this year. I hope some of you did. In late February, early March, of course, tens of thousands of beautiful snow geese stop here. And many, I know if you've been there, you know it's an amazing sight and sound when they all lift up in unison. And, close to sunset, they all fly into the fields to roost on the lake. This is a good example of what your camera can see, but your eye cannot. Like a ceiling fan spinning around and you can't see the individual fan blades. These snow geese flew and circled, and when you're there, you experience this amazing motion, but your eye cannot freeze and stop the scene like your camera can. These are tundra swans at Middle Creek, quite graceful when flying overhead. Another fast shutter speed to freeze the action of a street performer. So Jim and I were fortunate to go on a photography trip to Cuba. We actually just got back from another trip to Cuba less than a week ago where we photographed dancers. So these are from that first trip. And we had visited a local dance studio. It was dim in the room. Bright light was pouring in from the back windows. You can see here, not the best lighting conditions. So in this case, I set my camera. It was a Sony a6000 to an automatic preset called sport mode, which means the camera would pick all the settings needed to freeze the action. So it has a very high ISO of 3200, which can create some noise or graininess. But for me, I would prefer to have some noise in the image and be able to capture unique dance actions rather than have a perfect quality shot and miss the whole point. We had also attended a performance by a Santeria dance troupe. Santeria is an Afro-Cuban religion. The dancers perform this frenzied trance-like dance to drums. It was just fascinating to watch. And at 1/200th of a second, it was fast enough to freeze most of the action, but you still see a bit of blur on the dress and the hair. So those examples were all done with natural light, but the burst of a flash is much faster than the shutter speed of your camera. To really capture high-speed movement, it's best to use a flash. So although the shutter speed is 1/200th of a second, the motion is frozen by the flash, which is actually faster, as fast as 1/10,000th of a second. So these were just done at home by dropping colorful objects into a fish tank. And you need to pre-focus where you think your subject will be because it happens way too fast for any kind of autofocus to work. So, and here's the setup if you want to try this. You need a fish tank, a dark background behind the fish tank. I just hung up a black blanket behind it. That squeegee is there because you get some little bubbles forming on the glass. And then you pre-focus on an object. That hammer is in there with the blue tape. Set up the camera on a tripod, focused right there because that's where I think the strawberry is going to be when I set the flash off. And then change your camera to manual focus. Use an off-camera flash. Have a friend drop fruit or other objects into the fish tank. Pick a friend who doesn't mind getting wet. It gets a little messy. And here's some other items that I played with. So look around your house, see what you can experiment with, or get into the action yourself. And don't be afraid to get wet. And again, at 1/60th of a second, you would not freeze those bubbles unless you had a flash. And if you don't have a fish tank or an external flash, you can still create images like these. I picked up a flat, clear-sided plexiglass vase at the dollar store that works quite well for this. just set up a strong desk light for some side lighting and filled it with seltzer water. And capturing the motion of smoke is fun. Just burn some incense, use a flash. So long exposure. Images can be recorded in a fraction of a second or over much longer periods of time. Fraction of a second, the movement is frozen. Now it's slowed down to 1/15 of a second, introducing some blur, allowing the camera to capture the movement of the birds. And even with wildlife, longer shutter speeds can lead to surprising new images. So, I like to experiment with different shutter speeds just to see what I can come up with. Fast shutter speed, slower shutter speed. Neither one is right or wrong. It just depends on what you want to convey. I love this capture by Jim. It's of a snow goose at Middle Creek. And here's one of mine, quite surreal, maybe a little bit haunting, I think. Or slow that shutter down a bit to capture the motion of snow flying in an open window. If I had shot this at 1/500th of a second or faster, the snow would have been captured as tiny specks instead of these streaks, which gives more a feel of motion. And time exposures, of course, can allow us to record things that we can't see with the naked eye. We can stretch out those streaks of light, the headlights on the left and the taillights on the right. And I love trying to capture a mix of static objects and moving objects, the people standing motionless while the train speeds by. And with a long shutter speed, people in motion, they take on ghost-like qualities. Quite abstract, but you can still tell this is a train speeding by. So this is a highway. These cars are probably doing 60 miles an hour. This is a 2-second exposure to capture these streaks of light. In a small downtown, the cars were moving much slower, so this was a full 8 seconds. The camera's on a tripod, a must, of course, when doing an 8-second exposure. And the same small downtown, this is in Westchester, by the way. I'm on the roof of the public parking lot, and the roof has this high cement wall around it. I actually had to raise the tripod in the air and brace the tripod legs against the wall to get the camera high enough to get this shot. I just had to guess in the direction of the camera. I think I got a lucky guess. So let's capture some wildlife in motion. This is a school of menhaden fish in Cape Cod, and they were just moving so fast. I just love this spiral pattern they made. And, here's a selfie of my shadow just to give you an idea of the sense of scale and how many there were. A muskrat at Bombay Hook in Delaware. Here I was really happy to get this reflection. This is a pretty unlucky fish. I'm not quite sure what the bird is, some kind of a stork. This was from a wonderful trip Jim and I took to Botswana a few years back. A few more from that trip. This one makes me laugh. And these elephants, they would dust themselves. First, they splash themselves with water, and then they create their own dust storm. The dust cools them off, and apparently it protects their skin from parasites. And here's a capture of just the elephant tossing the water up. A hippo thrashing about while sparring with another hippo. This was really intense. This one much calmer. A baby baboon cradled by its mother. So let's move on to setting up the scene and waiting for something to happen, like Henri Cartier-Bresson's famous image, believed that he would scout out his composition and wait to capture that precisely timed, meaningful moment. So find a good location and then just wait for a subject to enter the frame and complete the composition. Here's a series of images by Jim. This is a reenactment of the Revolutionary War of the Battle of Brandywine. He was attracted to the repeating patterns of the soldiers' tents. And by moving around, he framed a nice composition of the leading lines through those 2 rows of tents. And every so often, some of the soldiers would walk through the frame. So he just stayed there for a while, hoping to capture someone of interest at just the right moment. And there it is. When this young soldier walked through with the drum on his back, he felt he had something special. And I agree. And I had the same idea in Cuba. I was fascinated by the colors and the shapes of the painted wall, the peeling paint on the door. So I sat on the curb across the street and just watched the people go by. And, this guy in the pink cap, he wasn't going anywhere. Then I noticed that that low sun was creating some dramatic shadows. And I thought, oh, can I get the man with the cap perhaps showing an interaction with a shadow? And then it happened. Here's my finished shot. And I think it's graphically pleasing. And I love the story and the expression on this man's face. And another example by Jim, Grand Central Terminal in New York. The bright sunlight was pouring in at a low angle, creating long shadows. And he positioned himself in the middle of the commotion and just waited. He started out by framing the people, and then he tilted the camera down. He started to focus less on the people and more on the shadows, and just waiting for something interesting. And here it is. This was the decisive moment. The foot on the left, the foot on the right, they're both lifted off the floor, showing the movement. And the shadow of the little girl holding her father's hand that captured the moment he was waiting for. Okay, so up until now, we have held the camera steady and either frozen motion or allowed motion to move and be captured. Let's shake that up a bit. Now we move the camera, intentional camera movement, or ICM as it is sometimes referred to. I know many of you know this and have already experimented with it, but it's it's a different branch of photography, and the final result, it produces sort of a blurred, maybe colorful, abstract image on purpose. So, think of it as being like an expressionist painter. And panning is one of the most popular ICM techniques. It's easy and fun. So using a slow shutter speed, maybe 1/30th, 1/15th of a second, you swipe your camera up or down. You're panning your subject. Sometimes these are called swipes. And, I think part of the fun of panning is that you never really know how your image will turn out. Another example of how our eyes and the camera see things differently. If you look at a tree with your eyes and move your head up and down, you'll likely still see that tree well defined, but the camera doesn't. It sees a blur. And you can do this with a tripod, but I usually do it handheld. I kind of brace my elbows against my side like this, just to try to keep the camera as steady as possible. And trees really work very well, as although you get a dreamy sort of surreal image, you can still recognize the subject. It does take a lot of experimentation and be prepared to delete a lot of misses. This one's got a bit of a shake to it, giving it a different sort of staccato, jumpy feel. But it doesn't have to be trees. This effect can work well on flowers. You probably recognize this as of tulips. And I like to just plop down on the ground and play with this technique. I just really like the abstract movement effect. This one's not recognizable, but very abstract. It's a very colorful bunch of autumn leaves. And I like to experiment with other subjects and go beyond nature. So you'll recognize this place, of course, steel stacks. And I just love the colors and the textures there. The patterns are fantastic. But how about a motion blur? Very abstract, but beautiful. At the Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia, just a small panning blur gives it a ghost-like effect. The ocean, now the panning is horizontal. Now, on all these examples, the camera is moving, but the subject is not. Let's go back to Cuba, a different kind of panning. Now, both the subject and the camera are moving. We follow our subject with the camera, and this allows us to get the subject relatively sharp and blur the background. So these next few images are ones that I just took last week when Jim and I were in Cuba. And you try to match the subject's rate of movement and the direction in which it's traveling. So you're basically going to swivel in your camera along a parallel axis to the moving subject, and you hope to get maybe at least a part of your subject in focus. And these colorful old cars, they were a distance away from me. So I'm panning at about this speed. I'm going swipe, swipe. Now it gets really crazy. At the velodrome, I know some of you have been there, velodrome in Pennsylvania. These cyclists are very close to the camera. So the panning has to take place much faster. Now I'm going like this, swipe, swipe, swipe. It was really hard. So all you see in focus is this guy's knee and this explosion of motion in front and behind. And I want to give another shout out to Ginny Lodge here because I saw that she has an article and images published in the March, April issue of Pennsylvania magazine on the velodrome. And I think she went with Valerie Hoffman. So I know they've both been there and I'm sure they've experimented with this. And you get some crazy stuff, quite surreal. But I love the effect created by the spinning of the spokes. So if you want to try this, select shutter priority on your mode dial and, start with 1/30th of a second. You have to adjust it faster or slower, depending on how fast your subject is moving and how far away you are from the subject. And just practice panning, practice. And it does help, by the way, if you keep the motion going even after your shutter ends. That way you don't kind of prematurely dip your camera. And be prepared to take lots of frames, of which most will be throwaways. But I actually enjoy surprises of bizarre, somewhat ghostly images like this. Here are a few more I took at a local cyclocross event. Cyclocross, so much fun to watch and photograph. But I just love how the wheels just disappear into the track. Now this one was coming down a hill, so I had to pan in a diagonal direction. That was new for me. I got pretty messy getting this one. It had rained the day before, which made a muddy mess. That's the best time to go, by the way. Lots of fun to watch. And I really like this one. I think it has the clear impression of speed, but a very colorful and strong composition. And what a fantastic opportunity to be at the finish line of the Boston Marathon in my dreams. I was watching it on TV and I thought, oh, I would just love to be in the camera car that goes along with the amazing runners. And then I realized from my living room couch, I kind of was in the camera car. So here you can see there's my TV right there. And I wondered, can I do some panning motion? Well, why not try? I slowed my shutter speed down to 1/10 of a second. And I took a gazillion bad shots, but I got a few that I liked. And, technically, these are not my shots, as I am shooting from video taken by another photographer. So I will not be entering these into a competition. But I'm still experimenting with yet another way to capture motion. That's how I learn. Okay, so let's add a new twist to intentional camera motion. And by new twist, I mean that literally. A normal picture of a colorful autumn tree. But if we twist our zoom lens, okay, let's twist it in or out, either way, you get some wonderful motion. Autumn trees with no zoom. Now just a slight zoom. This has quite an impressionistic look. Cityscapes can be fun. Or just a subtle zoom on neon lights for a new look. Or try a rotation blur. So this is not a zoom. I'm just spinning the entire camera, just rotating it while the shutter is open. Mistake. I do this a lot. I didn't even know I took this shot. Not sure if you would call this a zoom or panning or what. I was up on a ladder to get above the sunflowers and I must have pushed the shutter button on the way down, but I think it's kind of fun. And a perfect time to practice these motion techniques is with holiday lights. So here's the traditional Christmas tree shot, but watch what happens after I have a glass of wine. It's having a bit more fun. Oh, I like that. I think I'll have another. And with some more wine, it is really starting to party. Disco party. Okay, I think this one may have been after a little bit too much wine. It's actually a combination of zoom and rotating the camera at the same time. Again, a combination of panning, twisting, and a zoom blur, basically a hangover. So these are actually holiday lights on an outdoor tree. I had read an article by Olympus about doing these rotational blurs and decided to try it out. I put the camera underneath a lit tree and spun the camera. And a crop of one of my experiments, very abstract. I just like how you can see the effect of the pulsating lights. So these were hard to set up and try to get the camera on the tripod pointing straight up. So as usual, I wound up with some surprises. And it was freezing cold out. I probably hit the shutter with my gloves on and didn't know it, but I like it. Water, I think I'll take a sip. We can't have a conversation about motion photography without talking about water, because I think water is probably one of the best subjects to experiment with different shutter speeds to get very different results. Here's a fast shutter speed to capture and freeze the motion of water flowing over a sand dollar, or slow down to freeze the subject, but show the blur of the moving tide as the water sweeps back into the ocean. But hold on to your tripod if you try this. I almost lost a camera with this one. And this one is somewhere in between at 1/10 of a second. The splashes hitting the rocks kind of appear stretched out and are emphasized. This great blue heron is flying in one direction above rapids, going in another direction. So to freeze the motion, a very high shutter speed is needed. And of course, we have to talk about waterfalls. How do you get that smooth water flow? Some call it a cotton candy look. Do you want to get that look? That's up to you. So here you see the detail in the water, the crunchiness of it. Same scene, shutters opened longer now with that smoother look to the waterfall. And, keep in mind, neither approach is right or wrong, whichever you like best. So I'm going to take you through some waterfalls using different shutter speeds. So here's the same flowing water at different shutter speeds. So I started at 1/1000th of a second. I'm in the exact same place at 1/15th of a second. Now I've slowed it down even more and even more. So I just wanted you to see how you as a photographer can make artistic choices based on what look you like the best. But let's now get into how shutter speed affects exposure, because the more time your shutter is open, the more light is coming into your camera. So for these examples, I have switched to manual mode, which means I'm in control of all the camera settings. Now I've started at 1/250th of a second, which froze the moving water. So notice the crunchiness down here in the foreground area. Now at 1/15th of a second, a blur starts to occur, but it's still fairly sharp in that pool area in the center. It's a bit overexposed, but that could be adjusted by lowering the ISO. Now at a full second, notice that swirls are starting to form in the pool, and the waterfall and the cascading water in the foreground have a smoother appearance. At 2 seconds, even more motion is captured, but it's a bit overexposed. My ISO is 200. Let's cut that to 100 and see what happens. Okay, so it's the same 2 seconds, so the look of the water is basically the same, but at ISO 100, now the exposure looks good. So what happens if we go to 4 seconds to go for that really smooth cotton candy look? Well, so much light is now coming in that the image is overexposed, and I'm already at the lowest ISO. Well, you could change the f-stop, but for this example, I'll leave that constant. Instead, I'm going to add a neutral density filter on the front of the lens. It's kind of like putting on sunglasses, and that'll cut down the light. So yes, by adding that filter to cut down some light, the exposure looks much better, and I now have that smooth, dreamy look to the water. Here's one more at 6 seconds. And again, this may be too much smoothing out of the water for you. It really is for me, but that's up to you as an artist. A few more waterfalls. To be sure the surrounding landscape is in focus during a long exposure, tripod is essential. I can now check this one off my bucket list. spectacular but very popular waterfall in Oregon, and one of the largest waterfalls in Iceland. This has a drop of almost 200 feet, and you can walk right up to the base of it, and you get wet, but it's worth it. I love this lone figure dwarfed by the power of nature. And maybe some of you have been to Thunder Hole in Acadia in Maine. The waves rush into this small cavern, and the water is forced out with this thunderous roar, hence the name. This is not really a safe spot for this man to be standing. Some years ago, 3 people were on the rocks, and a rogue wave came up and washed them out to sea. Very powerful force of water. And a very different image of water, flowing and serene. This was of the swells created off the back of a powerboat. And the beautiful fountains at Longwood Gardens. And if you've been there, you know they don't allow tripods during the fountain show. So this is handheld. And I was somewhat far away. So you can see again, it's got a very high ISO of 16,000, creating some noise, but it doesn't bother me. Hey, we don't always have perfect weather conditions. While photographing at Ohiopyle State Park, Jim and I took cover in our car just before this huge storm blew through. So we're trapped in our car. What do? I took shots through the windshield of the pouring rain at varying shutter speeds. I'm practicing. And when the rain let up, I captured this graceful flow of water. Now, this one was taken on a bright sunny day. There was a sprinkler going, and the sunlight highlighted the streaks of water. And I just turned a bit, and this is the effect of 2 sprinklers crossing paths. Now, this one may be a bit difficult to figure out. You get the sense of water flowing, but the image it's a bit abstract. Is that some kind of a rabbit from Mars swimming through rapids? Well, it's actually simulated motion. In reality, nothing is moving. Might start to make sense in its original vertical orientation. It's a macro image of an icicle. So still talking about water, Jim and I do all sorts of wacky photo experiments. So we wanted to capture wine splashing up the side of a wine glass. You've seen this on some wine labels, like the expensive wine that I buy that comes in the big cardboard box. So Jim built this ramp and he put this wooden stop at the bottom. So when the glasses slid down, they would hit it, causing the liquid to flow up and out of the side of the glass. And, this took a lot of practice. We're getting closer, almost there. Yeah, pretty much it. Time to add some food coloring. Oops, we had a casualty. All right, we got it. Got some random splashes and finally got a pretty good one. Cropped in tighter for the final image and gave it a high key look. And another great way to capture motion using water is with reflections. Maybe nothing is moving, but it certainly looks like it is. Another reflection, and I think this gives the feel of one of those panning motion blurs, but it's just the distortion from the slight movement of the water. Quite impressionistic or quite abstract. The reflection of a windjammer in Maine. Okay, here comes another mistake. Jim and I do a lot of canoeing. We were paddling back from a twilight canoe trip, and I was intrigued by the reflections from the houses on the lake. So I'm in the front of the canoe taking pictures. Jim's in the back paddling. I think he intentionally rocked the boat because this is what I got. But I like it. I think it looks like curved Asian boats in front of a mountain range. It's quite peaceful, almost mystical. I do want to describe a bit more about neutral density filters as they can make quite a difference. The ocean in Acadia hitting the rocks, so you can see sort of the crunchy detail there at 1/125th of a second. But maybe you want to go for a different look, smooth out that water a bit. But going a full 6 seconds on a bright sunny day, it would look something like this. Way too much light is coming into your camera, and you can't adjust any settings to get a good exposure when your shutter is letting in bright sunlight for a full 6 seconds. So you have to put those sunglasses on the front of your lens. You add a neutral density filter. You can see this one. This is a 2-stop neutral density filter. And clouds. I love doing this with clouds. Jim does a lot of these. And by the way, Dutch Begley, I think, does a lot of this too. I've been very inspired by his work. Um, Clouds take on this mysterious feel when stretched out using that neutral density filter and a long exposure. So on all these, I'm using the same f-stop and ISO. Okay, I started out with clouds, 1/125th of a second. Nothing changes, only the time. Okay, so now the same clouds, it's a full 8 seconds, and you start to see those clouds stretch out. Okay, so let's go even longer. And you see now they are completely stretched out. To do that, I've added more neutral density. And this one is actually just the same image, just in black and white, because I just really like this look in black and white. Here's a beautiful sunset of the Philadelphia skyline. And I like these clouds, but they take on a whole different look when stretched out over 3 minutes. And again, I really like black and white with this look. And stars. Well, I haven't done a lot of night sky photography, and I just wanted to point out the challenges with the motion of the stars, or of course, the motion, it's really the motion of the Earth. You need to keep your shutter open long enough for enough light to reach your sensor. But if you leave it open too long, your stars turn into little streaks. So this was a 30-second exposure. I lit my daughter with a flashlight while the camera was on a tripod. Another Milky Way shot, but I thought this was kind of fun as it picked up a satellite or a plane moving through the night sky. And I know you've all seen images of star trails, much better ones than this one, but I finally did my first attempt. And it was a really bitter, cold, windy night. And I'm out in a farmer's field in Lancaster County, trying to find a dark sky area. So I set up the camera, used an intervalometer to time the images. So at least I didn't have to freeze my fingers by pushing the shutter, you know, over the course of 40 minutes. So for those of you who don't know how this is done, it's multiple images are shot and then blended together as layers in Photoshop. Okay, we are done with water and stars, something different. So how would you go about capturing the motion of tiny dandelion seeds flying off flower heads? Scanning. And I know if you've seen my other two presentations, I did talk about this. It is one of my favorite things to do. Camera is a flatbed scanner. This is just a scanner we bought to scan documents. The image on the left shows how tomatoes and onions were placed on the scanner. Here's the resulting image on the right. Notice that everything is not only upside down, it's backwards. So this is what an arrangement looks like as it's placed on the scanner. Looks like quite a mess, doesn't it? Here is the scan from that mess. So here you see on the right, a big mayapple flower, smaller mayapple flower covered by a sprig of azalea. I move over to the left. There's the big mayapple flower, the smaller mayapple flower covered with the sprig of azalea. So hopefully you get an idea of what's going on here. And here is how I use this to simulate motion. This is jewelweed. And as a child, I loved trying to gently grab these seed pods and then letting them pop open in my hand because it makes these springs that shoot the seeds out. So I just laid the pieces on the scanner to make it look like an exploding plant. Lettuce, tomatoes, and peppers gently falling to create this beautiful salad. So this is actually a composite of two images as the floating veggies were done on the scanner and the ball was just a straight on camera shot. And then the two were combined in Photoshop. How about a fireworks explosion of hosta buds? And okay, now I'm really getting a bit kooky. I took a CD and I slowly pulled it along the scanner as the light followed it down. So my fingers at the bottom. And I placed some old keys, an antique stopwatch, some beautiful chrysanthemums on the scanner. But I wondered what would happen if I left them on the scanner and did a scan every day for 3 weeks. So watch carefully. You will see the flowers start to change, to wither. Their color starts to fade to brown. I just love experimenting any way I can think of to simulate motion. And with scanning, you can simulate the magic of milkweed seed pods floating away. I don't know how you could capture this out in a field. So, okay, we are past the halfway point. Let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions. And I'll get a sip of water. So unmute yourselves, or Jay, let me know if there are any questions in the chat.
No questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, now's a great time. Tons of awesome ideas, Betsy. These are wonderful. Oh my
Thanks.
God.
Yeah,
I have to,
you can tell I like to experiment, right?
man,
I'm gonna get
I
it.
think I'm just guessing you have about 20 ideas at least I could try.
Well, hopefully there'll be some more. Okay, just getting a sip of tea here. My voice is holding up okay so far. For those of you who don't know, I'm coming off the flu that I brought back with me from Cuba.
Anybody have any questions before Betsy starts up again?
Okay, I shall continue. And let's move on to rear curtain sync. Okay, so when shooting with flash and using a slow shutter speed, you can record movement and freeze it at the same time. So here I held up 4 golf balls. Jim opened the shutter and I dropped them. They bounced down, back up, suspended for a fraction of a second before coming down, and then flash to freeze them. Here I did a selfie with a 10-second delay on the timer. So there's a setting in most cameras called rear curtain sync. So basically, anytime you take a shot in your camera, the first curtain opens, letting the light into your camera. Then at the end of the exposure, the second curtain closes, and then they reset and get ready for the next shot. Well, with rear curtain sync, a flash goes off. Well, first of it opens up, I'm moving around, okay? And then a flash goes off right before the second curtain closes. And that's why you see something in focus. So you see a combination of the blur before the flash went off, and then I'm more in focus. That's the flash. So then I experimented with some light sticks and probably some wine while Jim tries to ignore me in the next room. And Jim and I played around with this, trying to make it work. So here's a 2-second exposure as I move through the frame, and the flash went off at the end. I like this one. I think it looks like my hair flew off. And we had this modeled kind of gray background set up, which is why you see sort of a smoky textured look here. And I like the textured look, but this is not quite what we were trying to achieve. So I asked for a black background for my birthday. This is the look we wanted to create with the black background. And I relied on Jim as the lighting expert. So on the right, he set up this continuous light in a softbox that diffused and spread the light as I was jumping around. So that's from the softbox light. And then on the left was a speed light that fires at the end of the exposure to freeze the action. And another from the same photo shoot. Jim says I look like an angel. Ah, okay. LAPP, or light art performance photography. It's not only a mouthful, it's a style in which you literally paint your pictures with light. Now, this is fun. The crazy part is it's created with only one picture. No Photoshop skills needed. You just grab a light and experiment. If I was in a real room with you, I would ask you to guess how I did this. Some of you can probably guess. We attached a string of LED lights to a canoe paddle. And this is the motion of the paddle as Jim paddles in the dark, and I take a 30-second shot. And another. And some of you have probably done this, fire spinning. It's done by swinging steel wall that's been set on fire. So the Chester County Club hosted a workshop. We're actually hosting another one. If anyone's interested, we may have some extra openings. We're doing it in April, and we do it at a safe location. There's in Westchester, there's a firefighter training location. And with a slow shutter speed of 10 seconds, you capture this rain of sparks flying down. So of course we did something similar at home. Now, Jim has me holding a grinder on a piece of sheet metal to create these flying sparks. This is actually another example of rear curtain sync, as it's a long exposure of a half second to show the spray of those flying sparks and then a flash to light me at the end of the exposure. And then next thing I know, Jim asked me to wear my dark exercise clothes, and then he's wrapping colorful string lights around me. Now, what is he trying to do? This. He had me run through the frame when it was dark enough. So again, a combination of light painting, or LAPP, and rear curtain sync, as the flash was burst at the end to freeze the image of me. Now, this one usually stumps people. How is this done? Most people will be stumped except Bob Gross, because I think he was there when we did this one. We have a friend, Charles, who loves playing with all sorts of toys to create light motion. And he did this workshop for our club. So you can see here a bicycle tire with the lights placed around the rim. And here you see it in the dark, and you get the idea of how it spins on the floor, 4 seconds for it to go in one rotation. And this is our friend Charles just walking through the frame. He's kind of moving that bicycle wheel around. And here's Charles holding his lightsaber. And this image gives you an idea of what's going on. This is what the image looks like in the dark. And here he is swinging it around him. You can actually see a silhouette in the middle. And here's my husband, Jim, again. Isn't he a good sport? So for this one, Charles is walking around Jim waving a red flashlight wand. My camera was on bulb mode, meaning that the shutter was opened with a remote cable and left open until Charles was finished painting with light. And then he said, stop. The remote button was pushed again to end the exposure. And that's why you see that strange 53 seconds there. It was done manually. Let's move on to long exposures with multiple flash. Now we paint with bursts of light. This is a single frame of just 2 dancers. A tripod is a must. You set it up in pre-focus, turn out the lights, leave the shutter on for 8 seconds. Burst of flash from a speed light was manually triggered 4 times to freeze the dancers in motion. This one's also 8 seconds. The flash was shot 5 times. So we're in the dark, flash, 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 flash as they're dancing. This was done at that workshop by our friend Charles. But of course, Jim and I have to try this at home. So this was done with a Canon Speedlight, which you can set in multi-mode, which means it was preset to fire 5 bursts per second for 3 seconds. So here's a rather surreal image, but this is what it started out like. And we made many attempts at this, and I put this in to show you how hard it is, because most are just a confusing jumble. Hard to tell what the heck you're looking at. But this image of Jim's, I actually cropped in on it because I just like this, that jumble of hands there. I thought that came out pretty cool. So this one actually worked a little bit better. Jim lowered the number of flash bursts from 15 down to 9. So now it's a little bit less jumbled. And here, I think I'm about to punch myself in the face. And we again experimented last year when Bob Gross hosted a flash workshop where many of you are right now at Goggleworks. Bob had quite a few creative setups, including this one with multiple flashes going off while this skeleton was slowly pushed across the floor in a chair with wheels on it. So Jim and I brought along the model. We call him Uncle Dudley. And I don't remember who had the idea to put the shades on Uncle Dudley. To me, it kind of looks like Men in Black, but thanks, Bob, for a great workshop. And Jim was awarded this toy at one of our camera club celebrations. It's called a pixel stick. And there are 200 tiny LED lights along the edge of this stick. And the pixel stick, it comes with a dozen built-in patterns, different colors, rainbow patterns. And I know someone in the club also brought one to Bob's workshop last year and did share it with others. And if you wave the stick about a bit while walking, it creates these really cool patterns. So this is that pre-programmed rainbow pattern. And you can create fun stuff like this. Here, Jim asked me to hold the pixel stick close to the ground and walk through our woods. Let's add a person to the shot. We asked our friend to pose as still as possible while we walked behind her with the pixel stick so she appears in silhouette. Remember that rear curtain flash? Now we've used that technique with the pixel stick. So you can see that's me over there on the far left as I'm finishing up walking the pixel stick behind Jim. And at the end of the exposure, we've added a flash. So now Jim has been lit and frozen because the flash burst is very fast. Another example, this time I am the subject. But here is where the pixel stick gets really crazy. You can load your own image into the pixel stick, and each one of its 200 LEDs acts like a pixel on a screen, displaying your image one vertical line at a time as you walk. So here we have our friend Bob set up like he's raising a glass to himself. Well, we already had this picture of Bob, and we downloaded this picture onto the pixel stick. Then we just asked Bob to sit in the dark, hold up his beer bottle, sit still, Bob. He had no idea what we were doing. That other image of Bob is in the stick. And as Jim walks by, slices of the photo flash. All you see at the time is this weird stick blinking lights. It almost looks something like this. And then when Jim was done walking with the stick, we lit Bob with a burst of flash. Alas, the end result is real Bob and virtual Bob together. This is a single frame. It is not photoshopped. For this one, I'm actually sitting in a canoe that's on a picnic table. Well, Jim builds and restores wooden canoes, and this is actually one that he built. An image of the ocean was loaded into the pixel stick, and then Jim walked by twice, once with the ocean image on the stick behind me, and then again in front of me. And then he loaded this creepy picture of himself and walked up behind me. He told me to look scared. I had no idea what image was on this stick. But yeah, that's pretty creepy. So what if you are the motion? So you've seen examples like this, where the photographer and the camera are stationary and the subject has movement. So here you see ghost-like images of the people as they move on the escalator. Well, what happens if the photographer is moving on the escalator? Both the photographer and camera are moving through something that is stationary. So the escalator steps are sharp as the camera and the steps are both moving together, but the sides of the escalator show the motion as the camera moves up and the sides do not. So I had to try this one about 20 times. I was paddling solo and I had to paddle really hard to get the canoe moving and then lay back down low to get the bow of the canoe in the shot. I had a lot of misses. This is that same canoe that Jim built. But you get the idea. The canoe is sharp as the camera is moving with the canoe while the grasses in the water appear to glide by. Okay, now we're going to take it up yet another level. What if you are in a car going 25 miles per hour while you pan a subject? As the car goes by, you rotate the camera to keep the subject in the frame. You do need two people to do this, a driver and a photographer. And you get this swirly, crazy rotation effect. I'm going to see if I can demonstrate, if you can see me in the little tiny zoom box there. Okay, so this white paper, that's a tree, okay? I'm in a car. There's a road going by the tree. Jim's driving. I'm hanging out the passenger window. I point my camera towards the tree, and as the car goes by, I keep the camera pointed at the tree. So my camera is rotating, okay? So it's actually a combination of lateral movement and rotational movement. And it works great with colorful trees such as dogwoods or redbuds in spring. Colorful trees in autumn is my favorite. But you can also focus on other subjects such as this cabin in Valley Forge. I just like how you can see the rotation effect on the grass. I think this kind of looks like ghosts are leaving the cemetery. And sometimes it results in a hurricane of texture and color. I just love this type of photography. It makes me feel the excitement of connecting with the forest as I move through it. And then, it's quite abstract, impressions of color and texture. The details are dissolved by the motion, but in most images, there's enough form retained to suggest a sense of subject. So here are the how-to notes if you want to try this. You do it from a moving car. You do need two people. Don't do this on your own. You rotate the camera and keep it pointed at your subject about 25 miles per hour, although I have done this on the highway going 50. It's just harder. About 1/15 of a second. It does take a lot of practice and you get a lot of throwaways. Seriously, I may take 100 images to get one that I like. Okay, let's get creative. Up until now, all images, with the exception of the star trails and the falling salad, have been done in camera. No Photoshop necessary. Let's look at ways to create or simulate motion using post-processing tools. So this looks like a zoom blur, but it was actually a fully focused sunflower. The radial blur was added in Photoshop. So I'm not going to get into any how-to specifics in Photoshop. That would take way too long. I just want to share a few ideas of how you can use post-processing to simulate motion. I wanted to capture fireflies and create sort of a magical fairyland look. So I took about 20 shots, each one 6 seconds to capture the movement of the lightning bugs. And it's actually quite easy to blend them together as layers in Photoshop. Here I started with a normal shot of birch trees. And in this case, I added the blur in Photoshop. But this is different than the panning blurs we did before because I wanted to add some of the bark texture back in. Okay, a little bit of the bark texture there. I'm going to go back and forth without the bark texture, with the bark texture. I think just gives it a different look. This was done by bringing both images into Photoshop as layers and just brushing a bit of the texture from one image onto the other. Back to setting up the scene, waiting for something to happen. This time I'll give it a little Photoshop help. Chelsea Market in New York City. There's this stretch of flooring that's lit from below, and I loved watching this variety of legs and shoes, and I felt there had to be a shot, so I sat on a bench in the dark and I just kept taking lots of shots. And back home at the computer, I like this one with the wheelchair, this one with the colorful shoes. So I decided to combine the two, and here's my finished image. To me, this represents the hustle and bustle and diversity that I was experiencing at the time. And I didn't even realize until about a month later that the colorful shoes walking out of the frame, it's the same pair of shoes walking into the frame. Oh, well, I think it's okay. Remember this one done in camera using the long exposure and rear curtain sync? This motion blur was all done in post-processing by adding a blur filter in Photoshop. I love the solitude of this lonely figure walking on a shallow beach in Cape Cod. But here's the original image, dust spots and all. Not a great photo, but I liked the mood, so I decided to try to give it a little help in Photoshop. So I used a motion blur filter to smooth out the waves and enhance the color to create the serene scene, because this is how I remember the magic of those endless patterns of the shallow waves. And a fun trick you can use on seascapes. Here I used a fast shutter speed to capture the crashing surf. Here I used that neutral density filter to show the soft, sort of more romantic look to the ocean, but I wanted to add back the excitement of the waves. I can combine the two images and brush in the waves and spray from the other image. A couple images captured of skateboarders at FDR Park in Philadelphia.
BPS.
I like the shadow on this one. And this one caught in midair. A second later, this guy was on the ground. These were done, of course, with a fast shutter speed. And I wondered if I could simulate the motion by using multiple images, similar to what Thomas Eakins did way back when. I stood in one place and put my camera on burst mode. 13 images blended together in Photoshop. And I did the same with the snow geese at Middle Creek. This is about 30 separate exposures of images taken in burst mode and then combined in Photoshop. So as opposed to just freezing birds in flight, I think it gives the impression of movement. I mean, you can see the flight pattern as they move across the sky. And this one's my favorite, as I think the pattern they made actually took on the shape of a bird in flight. And I do want to share my thought process on a shot. Jim is in charge of workshops for the Chester County Camera Club, and he does love ballet. So he had set up a photo workshop with the Brandywine Ballet Company in Westchester, and they provided the dancers in their studio, and we had our club members bring in studio lights, and it was a lot of fun. The dancers were amazing. I think everyone came away with shots they were happy with, and I got quite a few as well. But in addition to shots like this one, I wanted something unique. I mean, there were 25 camera club members in the same place shooting the same poses. I wanted a shot that no one else in the group that day would have. I wanted this. Remember the story of Ansel Adams and visualization, the combination of imagination and technique. I wanted to show a progression of movements, so I visualized this in advance and I had to plan what I needed to do. So, how did I do this one? Well, most of the images were shot with a very fast shutter speed. That's why we brought all the high powered lights. So you can see here, this image was shot to freeze the amazing Amanda at the height of a leap, high ISO, 1/1000th of a second. Now look what happens when we go with a much longer shutter speed of 1/3 of a second. Now that's a bad shot. I don't want a two-faced Amanda, but I wanted to show you that you need to take a lot to get a few that you like. So here are the shots that I used straight out of camera. 1, 2, 3, 4, and this last one. I wanted her to face the opposite direction, so I turned her around. Put them together in Photoshop for the finished image. And a different technique to show motion. I took multiple images in succession and brought them in as layers in Photoshop. And by lowering the opacity of some of the images, there's just a subtle sense of graceful movement. And this was done the same way. And sometimes I just like to experiment. I wondered, well, what would happen if I put Amanda, the ballet dancer, inside one of my swirly hurricanes? And we drove by these giant wind turbines. And I thought, well, let me try the same technique here. So here you go, 20 images combined in Photoshop. Okay, so the last series I will share shows some examples of images that began in my imagination, and then I had to figure out how to create it. This one was a bit more difficult. The model was not as cooperative as it appears in this finished image. My dog Shadow did not want to sit still. So this presented a different kind of motion challenge, how to make it stop. This took a couple of assistants. There's Jim and our daughter Alex. Took a lot of flour and a lot of tries. And he finally figured out, put a little bit of peanut butter on that spoon. That did the trick. This is the shot I used of our dog Shadow. Had Jim toss some flour around, removed Jim's hand, added the flying flour for the motion. Shadow the chef. This is not the final shot nor the final model. Now I want to set up a dramatic shot and recreate Lizzie Borden. You've heard of her. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. So we started by setting up the lighting and camera angle. Jim set up side lighting. We wanted that scary look. So I actually have the camera lying on the floor. You can see that I'm triggering the remote in my hand. Now I bring in the real model, our daughter Alex, and try to get her to look menacing. She kept cracking up. And, you know, this took quite a few shots. Here I'm holding a fan to try to get her hair to fly up. First, I tried a hair dryer. It wasn't powerful enough. So I held up an electric fan and that put some motion in her hair. And, you know, we're making adjustments to the lighting. We had problems because the axe was casting a shadow across the side of her face. Okay, that's a bit better. I think I went with this one and did some editing. My finished image, Lizzie Borden, makes me shudder. And another version from the same shoot in sepia to give it sort of an old time look. Still quite terrifying, don't you think? And this is our other daughter, Kelsey. She looks a bit nicer. So Jim and I watch a lot of photography videos and we like to practice lighting. He's much better at lighting than I am. And he set up this beautiful softbox light above Kelsey. But for Kelsey, I didn't use a fan. I brought in the leaf blower. and then Jim put a couple colored gels on the lights. And I asked her to pose with a lantern like she was afraid and running away. She plays a virtual game with friends called Pathfinders that includes dragons. So I envisioned a composite of her running through the forest, chased by a dragon. Then I photographed her Pathfinder dragon. Went into my archives and found an image of the redwood forest in Oregon, added a blue tone in Photoshop, and blended them together. Now I just need to add the dragon. And you know what? I hate it. I just think it looks stupid. So not everything goes according to plan. So I scrapped the dragon, but I still kind of like the image. I thought, well, let me change the crop a bit. I want to add a light in the lantern and change the glow on her face to match the lantern light. Finished image into the woods, and you can use your imagination as to what she is running from. Two more examples, and then we'll wrap this up. So the Chester County Club has a fun summer challenge. And a few years ago, the theme was song titles. We were assigned 10 different song titles to illustrate with our photography. You may know the song I Set Fire to the Rain by Adele. Well, I immediately visualized the image I wanted it to create. I wanted it to rain water and rain fire on me. So I started with a shot of me in one of our canoes. Jim also built this canoe. Cropped in, I'm going to use this in the shot. And then I used the fire from that fire spinning workshop. And I'm going to use some of these sparks in the final image. Then I needed rain. So I just asked Jim to hold up the hose at our garden. And I practiced with different shutter speeds, fast, a bit slower, added some clarity in Lightroom. Now I had my rain. Next, I composited the rain, the sparks, and the image of me. And you can see how I tilted them, the layers. I left the layers here so you could see how I brought them in. All I need to do is add some sparks on the umbrella. Finished image, I set fire to the rain. So these summer challenges, they're a lot of fun. They do force us to think outside the box and really get creative. And I'll tell you, I've done some wacky and embarrassing stuff. Last one. You may know the song It's All About That Bass by Meghan Trainor. If you do, you know it's actually all about one's derriere. So an image popped into my mind. There was a rather famous image making its rounds on the internet of Kim Kardashian with her rather shapely butt. So yeah, I have no shame. I'm going to try to replicate this shot of Kim Kardashian. I did this when Jim went out. I was too embarrassed to even let him know what I was doing. So you can see I'm holding the remote and I'm trying different poses and I bring in the props. And this is the one I went with. Remember those wine glasses with the splashing wine? Here they are again. Finished image. Yeah, it's pretty clear. I ain't no size 2, but I can shake it like I'm supposed to do because, you know, I'm all about that bass. So yeah, you know, we all go a bit stir crazy while stuck at home, whether it's due to COVID, wildfire smoke, bad weather, whatever. But there are so many photo techniques you can learn and try out at home. You don't need to travel. Just experiment, try something new, and have fun. And I have had fun giving this presentation to you. And to all of you, I say thank you. And I will share one more image with my contact info. Jay can probably get it to you, but if you want to write this down, our website is letscapturethemoment.com. Jim and I share this website. And if you go to the heading called Photo Fun, you will see more in-depth info on many of the techniques I've covered, the scanning, the swirlies, all sorts of things. There's actually a whole area under Photo Fun on motion photography. And my email address there, bwilson1773. If you have any other questions after tonight and you want to shoot me an email, please feel free to. So with that, again, I say thank you. Turn on your mics and your video. I will stop sharing your screen. Let me know your comments or questions. And thank you.
Totally amazing, Betsy. You never cease to amaze. You and Jim are my inspiration for the day that I retire. I'll tell you what, It's awesome to see someone retired and not sitting around, that's for sure.
I know, I know. Yeah, yeah, we motivate each other, that's for sure.
I don't think you guys have any time to do work around the house.
Well, we've got a lot of work to do around the house, but somehow it doesn't get done.
Well, I know why. That's great.
Any
Okay, who
questions
has
or comments?
questions? Speak up, everybody. You got to speak up. Now's your chance to ask Betsy questions.
Bob, how about at Goggleworks? Anything there? You're muted.
Betsy, I have a
Yeah.
question, but I'm on David Lobel's iPad. My name's Julie Stauffer. Wonderful presentation, lots of ideas. But when you were doing the multiple flash images in a sequence across,
Uh-huh.
what kept the first flash subject from being overexposed with the repeated flashes? Does that make sense?
It does make sense because it's closer than the other things. I think my short answer is I don't know the answer to that. Bob Gross, do you want to try answering that? You did this at Goggleworks. It's a really good question.
We're in total darkness and we're in front of a black background. So the only thing that showed up was what the flash was lighting, and it didn't light the dark background. As long
But
as
the question was, why wasn't like the four skeletons? The first skeleton was closer to the flash than the fourth skeleton. Yeah, and you know what? Now that I think about it, it may have been a little bit brighter, and I may have, in Lightroom darkened the first one.
It
But that was
wasn't that noticeable, though. I would have expected the first skeleton to be far more overexposed by the time you got to the fifth flash or
yeah,
the
that's a
fourth.
good question. Well, it depends. With the dancers, the flash, actually with those dancers that you saw, the flash was manually held, and that was facing the dancers, so they were all sort of equally exposed. The skeletons that Bob did, I think the flash was off to the side, wasn't it, Bob? So the closest skeleton probably was brighter, and I probably toned it down.
Okay,
no,
great.
every
Thank you.
skeleton was
Again, great presentation.
Thank you.
okay. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Anyone want to try?
Betsy, hi, Vince.
Hey, Vince.
The multiple flash, I haven't done flash photography since college, but um, if you wanted to get the opposite of what you did with the rear curtain and show the movement first, or the person say first and then the movement, would you not use rear? You would use the regular setup, not rear curtain?
That's correct. You would use front curtain sync. And actually, most cameras, I think, default to front curtain sync. So if you want to do rear curtain sync, you have to go in and change it. If you want to show motion, typically you want to show the trail of the motion. And, think of I've seen really good examples with a car, and you see like the front of the car, the headlights, and then you see this streak following behind the car. If you use front curtain sync, what you'll see is streaks in front of the car and then the headlights. It feels backwards. So to show motion, you will typically choose rear curtain sync. It feels better. It looks better.
Yeah, I would imagine there must be some creative time where that reverse might work. I don't know. Can't think of it. How about if you did rear curtain and you fired it twice at the front and at the end? Does that work?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if someone else on the call might know the answer to that. The way my camera is set up, with the rear curtain sync, the flash can only fire once, trigger once. There may be other cameras that can do it both ways, but that might be an interesting thing, actually, now that you mention it, to have it flash both at the beginning and the end and sort of the motion in the middle.
If you set up the camera to be in camera multiple exposure, that might be one way to do it. So
Yeah.
new Canon mirrorless will give you 9 9 shots. And I'm sure that Sony does a multiple in-camera exposure. So I wonder if there's some kind of combination of multiple exposure with multiple flashes.
There might be. There's always something new to learn, right?
Really, nice presentation. Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you.
Betsy, I liked, well, you kept saying, now let's get creative. Time, yeah. The whole presentation was creative beginning to end, and I can't wait to get together with you guys again and have some more fun.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun at Goggle Work. So yeah, I'd love to do that again.
And
Thank you.
can Dudley too. He's
Thank
always
you.
welcome.
Anything else? Well, I hope if nothing else, I've given you all some ideas to try and permission to make mistakes.
I think Jay got kicked off. He texted me. He got kicked off. So there are a few comments in the chat. Most of it wonderful, amazing, great presentation, creativity. The name of the name of what? Oh, what was the African bird's name? Yellow-billed stork.
Yellow-billed stork. I'll write that down. Thank you. Bird expert. Yellow-billed stork. Thank you. I always learn something every time I give a presentation. Someone teaches me something.
We have a lot of birders in our club, so.
Yeah.
But thank you again, Betsy. I love you that you took the time to help us out here. And like Jay said, there's about 20 different ideas that came up. And
Great.
and I love the oohs and ahs in the crowd here. It was like, oh, no.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well,
Yeah.
happy to share with you. And I thank you for inviting me again. Thank you, everybody.
Hope to see you soon.
Okay. Good night.